Cyril hit the ground hard. Her knees scraped against the jagged metal floor of the Vaxori Market District's underbelly, sending a sharp jolt of pain up her legs. She tried to push herself up, but a heavy boot slammed into her back, knocking the air from her lungs. The stench of oil, rust, and damp decay filled her nostrils as she sprawled onto the cold ground. "Stay down, runt," a guttural voice sneered above her. She gritted her teeth and turned her head just enough to see them. 3 of them, towering figures in tattered trench coats, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hoods. The leader, a broad-shouldered bracken with mottled gray skin and tusk-like fangs, crouched beside her, his reptilian fingers curling around the delicate silver chain around her neck. "No," she gasped, reaching up, but another thug grabbed her wrist and twisted it back with brutal efficiency. Pain shot up her arm, her body jerking involuntarily. The bracken yanked the necklace hard. The fine chain snapped against her skin, leaving behind a burning sting as he held up his prize, the small silver pendant dangling between his thick fingers. "Look at this," he laughed, tossing it between his hands. "Real metal. Must be worth something." "Please," Cyril choked out, the word barely escaping her lips. She fought against the hands pinning her, her body screaming in protest, but she was weak, too weak. Hunger and exhaustion had drained her long before this moment, and now her strength failed her entirely. The bracken leaned in, his hot, rancid breath ghosting over her cheek. "You're pathetic," he spat, crawling around in the gutters, acting like you belong here. The others laughed, as if it were some grand joke. "You're lucky we're leaving you alive," one of them said, their boot nudging her ribs hard enough to make her whimper. And then, just like that, they were gone. Their heavy steps faded into the chaos of the market above, swallowed by the ceaseless noise of traders and criminals bartering over stolen goods. Cyril curled in on herself, shaking, the pain she could endure. The bruises would fade, the wounds would heal. But the loss of the necklace, that was different. Her fingers trembled as she touched her bare collarbone, where the cool metal had once rested. It had been her mother's, a relic from a home she barely remembered. Cyril had been a child when she last saw her mother, before disease and starvation had stolen her away. The necklace had been the only thing left, her last connection to a life that had slipped through her fingers long ago. Now it was gone. Tears burned at the edges of her vision, but she refused to cry. Crying was weakness, and weakness got you killed in a place like this. Vaxori Prime was no place for the weak. A sprawling city world of metal and grime. It stretched endlessly beneath the cold void of space, its labyrinthine streets pulsing with the glow of flickering neon signs. Towering spires of industry loomed over slums thick with smoke, while below, the desperate and the damned fought for scraps. The powerful lived high above, in domed palaces safe from the filth, while those like Cyril, alone, starving, unwanted, were left to rot. No one would help her. No one ever had. And yet, footsteps, different from the hurried steps of thieves or the sluggish gait of the drunk and dying. Steady, confident, purposeful. Cyril tensed. She had nothing left to take, but that didn't mean someone wouldn't try. She forced herself to move, to push up onto her elbows, ignoring the sharp ache radiating through her ribs. Her vision swam, her breath coming in shallow gasps. A shadow fell over her. Still breathing, the voice was deep, rough, yet edged with something unexpected. Concern. She blinked up at the figure crouching in front of her, and her sluggish brain processed 2 things at once. 1, he was human. 2, he was unlike anyone she had ever seen before. Humans were rare in this sector, and the ones who did pass through were usually bounty hunters or mercenaries, dangerous men who lived by violence. But this one, he didn't look like a killer. Not exactly. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his form wrapped in a weathered brown jacket that barely concealed the holstered blaster at his hip. His dark hair was cropped short, a few unruly strands falling over piercing blue eyes that stood out even in the dim alley light. His features were sharp, chiseled, handsome in a way that made her pulse quicken despite her better judgment. But there was something else about him, Something in the way he tilted his head slightly as he looked at her, his brows furrowed. Not with cruelty, not with indifference, but with genuine concern. She flinched when he reached for her, expecting another blow. He stopped instantly. "Easy," he murmured, his voice softer now, almost soothing. "I'm not here to hurt you." Cyril didn't respond. She didn't know how to. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. He sighed, running a hand through his hair as if debating something, then extended his hand again, palm up. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you out of here." Cyril hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to push him away, to scramble back into the shadows where she belonged. But the exhaustion was too much, the hunger too deep, and the warmth of his hand, it was the first warmth she had felt in years. Slowly, tentatively, she placed her trembling fingers in his. His grip was firm, steady. He pulled her up effortlessly, holding her upright when her legs threatened to give out beneath her. His arm looped around her waist, supporting her weight without hesitation. She stiffened at the unexpected closeness, at the solid warmth of him. "I've got you," he murmured. Cyril forced herself to breathe. "Who?" Her voice cracked, her throat raw. "Name's Tyler," he said. "And you?" She hesitated before whispering, "Cyril." Tyler nodded once, as if sealing the knowledge away. "All right, Cyril, let's get out of this hellhole." She should have pulled away, should have demanded to know why a stranger, a human of all things, was helping her. But she didn't. Instead, for the first time in a long time, she let herself trust. Cyril's legs barely obeyed her as Tyler guided her out of the alley, his arm firm around her waist. Every step sent sharp jolts of pain through her ribs, and exhaustion clung to her like a heavy fog, but she kept moving. She had to. Vaxori's lower districts pulsed with artificial life around them. Towering neon signs flickered erratically, their vibrant blues and reds reflecting off wet metal streets. The air smelled of burning circuits, fuel fumes, and the stale sweat of too many bodies crammed into too little space. Voices, haggling, laughing, arguing, filled the air, yet not a single soul turned to look at her. No one had intervened when she was attacked. No one even glanced at her battered form now. This was Vaxori Prime. If you were weak, you were invisible. Tyler moved with the ease of someone who belonged here, his stride confident, eyes scanning their surroundings with practiced awareness. Cyril stole a glance at him, trying to make sense of him. He didn't carry himself like a local, nor did he look like the usual scavengers or bounty hunters that haunted these streets. He was too calm, calculated. She swallowed, forcing herself to speak. "Why are you helping me?" He didn't look at her right away. Instead, he maneuvered them past a group of off-world traders haggling over a crate of stolen energy cells, keeping a protective hand on her arm. Only when they were a few steps beyond them did he answer. "Because I was in the right place at the right time," he said simply. She frowned. "That's not an answer." Tyler sighed, running a hand through his short, dark hair. "No, I guess it's not." He glanced at her then, his piercing blue eyes sharp yet unreadable. "I came here for a job, a delivery. Got my payment, was about to leave." His jaw tightened slightly. "Then I saw those bastards dragging you into the alley." Cyril's stomach twisted. She knew what could have happened if he hadn't stepped in. She had heard the stories, seen the aftermaths. Women left broken in back alleys, their bodies tossed aside like garbage. The thought sent a shudder through her, and she gripped his sleeve without realizing it. Tyler noticed, but didn't comment. He simply slowed his pace, letting her steady herself. "Do you make a habit of rescuing strangers?" she asked, her voice quieter now. He huffed a short, humorless laugh. "No, but I also don't make a habit of walking past someone who needs help." Cyril wasn't sure what to make of that. In her experience, people didn't do things out of kindness, not without expecting something in return. They reached a docking lift, its rusted platform leading to the upper tiers where the spaceport was located. Tyler pressed a code into the panel, and the mechanism groaned to life, rising slowly. As the platform ascended, Cyril's exhaustion finally overtook her, and she leaned against the railing, staring out over the city. Somewhere out there, her necklace was in the hands of the men who had taken it. The thought sent a fresh wave of anger crashing through her. It wasn't just a necklace, she muttered, more to herself than to him. Tyler glanced over. Yeah, I figured. She hesitated, then exhaled, gripping the railing tighter. It was my mother's, the only thing I had left of her. For the first time since they met, Tyler's expression shifted. Something softened in his features, something that made her throat tighten. Then we'll get it back, he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Cyril blinked at him, caught between disbelief and something dangerously close to hope. You don't even know where they took it. Tyler smirked. I'm good at finding things. The lift came to a halt, and a gust of cold, artificial air hit them as the docking station stretched out before them. A maze of steel catwalks, flashing departure signs, and the scent of fuel lingering in the recycled atmosphere. Tyler guided her toward a ship nestled between two larger freighters. It wasn't a sleek vessel like the luxury liners of the rich, nor was it a battered rust bucket like most scavenger crafts. It was solid, functional, built for endurance rather than beauty. Tyler pressed his palm to a scanner, and the ship's ramp lowered with a hiss. Come on, he said, leading her inside. Cyril hesitated at the threshold. She had spent years trusting no one, surviving on her own. Stepping onto that ship felt like crossing an invisible line, one she might never be able to come back from. But the alternative was staying here, broken and empty-handed. She took a deep breath and followed him inside. The interior was surprisingly well kept. The cockpit was cluttered with old flight logs and spare parts, but the rest of the space was orderly, cleaner than she expected from someone like him. Tyler gestured toward a small medkit near the central console. Sit, he instructed. You're a mess. Cyril frowned but obeyed, easing down onto one of the cushioned seats as he knelt in front of her, rummaging through the kit. He pulled out a small vial and a cloth, then glanced up at her. This is going to sting. She tensed as he dabbed the cloth against a cut on her cheek, the antiseptic burning against her skin. She didn't flinch. She had endured worse, but she wasn't used to someone tending to her wounds. Tyler worked in silence, his movements efficient, his hands steady. There was something oddly grounding about him, something that made the weight in her chest just a little lighter. When he finished, he leaned back, studying her for a moment. You got anywhere to go? Cyril looked away. No. No home. No family. Nothing but the clothes on her back and an empty space where her mother's necklace should have been. Tyler exhaled through his nose, nodding to himself. Then you stay here, until we find those bastards. Cyril's heart thudded against her ribs. Why do you care? Tyler met her gaze, and for the first time, she thought she saw something unguarded in his eyes. Because I've lost things that mattered too, he said simply. The word struck something deep inside her, a wound she didn't realize she had been carrying. She wanted to ask what he had lost, who he had lost, but something told her he wouldn't answer. Instead, she swallowed and whispered, okay. Tyler pushed himself up, stretching his shoulders. Get some rest. We'll start tracking them in the morning. Cyril nodded, but as he stepped toward the cockpit, she found herself gripping the necklace-shaped void at her collarbone, her chest tightening. She didn't know if she believed in luck. But maybe, just maybe, meeting him wasn't a coincidence. The city pulsed with life, a beast that never slept. Vaxori Prime's underbelly was a maze of neon-lit streets and towering structures, a place where law was just a whispered joke and survival depended on how well you could disappear. The smell of burning fuel and damp metal clung to the air, mingling with the distant scent of food stalls selling questionable meat. Cyril walked beside Tyler, her fingers still curled around the empty space where her necklace had once been. She wanted to believe it was safe now, that having it back would mean she could finally breathe again. But the weight pressing on her chest told her otherwise. You good? Tyler asked, his voice steady low. Cyril hesitated before nodding. Yeah. He didn't look convinced. She wasn't either. Tyler had spent the last few hours tracking down leads, digging through the underworld of Vaxori like a man who had done this before. And maybe he had. She still didn't know much about him. Not really. He was good at finding things, at moving through places like this without standing out too much, but with just enough presence that people knew not to mess with him. Cyril, on the other hand, had spent her whole life trying to be invisible. But tonight, she wouldn't hide. Not when something so important had been stolen from her. She tightened her jaw, pushing back the flicker of fear in her gut as they approached the entrance to one of the city's black market dens, a towering structure built from old ship parts, its metal exterior glowing under the harsh neon lights. The people here weren't just criminals. They were the kind of criminals who made people disappear. Tyler pulled her to a stop just outside. "Listen," he said, his voice quieter now. "This isn't a place where you just walk in, grab your stuff, and leave. We do this smart, or we don't do it at all." Cyril exhaled sharply. "I know what I'm doing." Tyler studied her for a long moment. Then, with a nod, he led the way inside. The air was thick with smoke, voices blending into a dull roar as smugglers, bounty hunters, and traders made deals over stolen goods. The lighting was dim, the only real illumination coming from the flashing holographic displays showcasing everything from weapons to rare alien artifacts. And there, behind a reinforced counter, was her necklace. Cyril felt her breath hitch. The silver chain gleamed under the light, its delicate pendant resting between other stolen trinkets. A tiny thing, insignificant to anyone else, but to her, it was everything. Before she could move, Tyler placed a hand on her arm, his fingers pressing just firm enough to keep her grounded. "Wait!" She barely heard him. Her pulse pounded in her ears as her gaze locked onto the vendor. Krivox, a slug-like Zentari with beady yellow eyes and a mouth that curled into something that might have been a smirk. "That's him," she whispered. Tyler exhaled. "All right, let's see how much this is going to cost us." They approached the counter, moving with the ease of people who belong there, even if only one of them did. Krivox's eyes flickered over them, assessing, calculating. "You look like someone who's here to spend some real credits," he drawled, his voice a thick, guttural rasp. "What's your pleasure?" Tyler didn't waste time. "The necklace," he said, nodding toward it. Krivox chuckled. "Ah, man of taste. This little piece? Picked it up just yesterday. Real silver. Not common out here." His gaze slid to Cyril, and his grin widened. "Something tells me this has sentimental value." Cyril clenched her fists. "It's mine." Krivox sighed dramatically. "Possession is a tricky thing, sweetheart. Right now it's mine." Tyler leaned against the counter, his expression calm, unreadable. "How much?" The Zentari grinned, clearly enjoying himself. 50,000 credits. Cyril's stomach dropped. That was more money than she had seen in her entire life. Tyler let out a slow breath. "That's ridiculous." Krivox shrugged. "Sentiment costs extra." Something in Cyril snapped. She wasn't going to let this happen. Not again. Not this time. Before she could second-guess herself, she moved. Her hand shot forward, fingers wrapping around the necklace. But the moment she touched it, Krivox moved faster than she expected. A thick, slimy appendage lashed out, striking her wrist with enough force to knock her back. She stumbled, cursing under her breath, but before Krivox could press the advantage, Tyler was already moving. The human was fast. Too fast. 1 second, he was leaning casually against the counter. The next, he had vaulted over it. Cyril barely saw what happened next. A sharp crack, the dull thud of flesh hitting metal. And then Krivox was on the ground, groaning. Tyler stood over him, calm as ever, adjusting his jacket like nothing had happened. "Now," he said, his voice quiet, deadly, "I think we'll be taking that necklace." Krivox wheezed. You're insane." Tyler sighed. "Yeah, I hear that a lot." With that, he grabbed the necklace, tossed it to Cyril, and took her wrist. "Time to go." Cyril was still processing what had just happened as they pushed their way through the crowd. The moment they stepped out onto the streets, she turned to him. "You just punched one of the most connected black market dealers on this planet." Tyler shrugged. "Yep." Cyril gaped at him. "He's going to send people after us." "Probably. You don't even care, do you?" Tyler glanced at her then, and for the first time, there was something almost amused in his expression. "Not really. You got your necklace, didn't you?" Cyril swallowed, fingers tightening around the cool metal of the chain. "Yeah," she admitted. "I did." They stopped walking. The sounds of the city buzzed around them, but for a moment, it was just the two of them. Tyler exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "You all right?" Cyril didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached up, unclasping the necklace and holding it out toward him. He frowned. "What are you doing? You should put it on me." Tyler blinked. "Oh, what?" Cyril gave him a pointed look. "You fought for it. You might as well be the one to put it back where it belongs." For once, Tyler seemed at a loss for words. But after a beat, he took the necklace from her hands, his fingers brushing against hers. Warm, steady, real. Cyril turned, pulling her silver-white hair to one side. The cool metal pressed against her skin as he fastened the clasp, his touch lingering just a second longer than necessary. When she turned back around, their faces were inches apart. Her breath hitched. Tyler didn't move, didn't step away, and neither did she. The moment stretched between them, charged, fragile. Then, finally, he cleared his throat. "We should probably keep moving before Krivox sends someone to kill us." Cyril forced a breath. "Right. Good idea." But as they walked side by side into the depths of Vaxori's underbelly, her heart was still racing for an entirely different reason. Cyril sat on the edge of a storage crate inside the ship's dimly lit cargo bay, turning her reclaimed necklace over in her hands. The cool metal pressed against her fingertips, grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. It should have felt like a victory, getting it back, reclaiming the only piece of her mother she had left. But instead, her chest felt tight, her thoughts tangled. Tyler leaned against the metal wall across from her, arms crossed, watching her in that silent way he always did. She could feel the weight of his gaze, steady and unreadable. He hadn't said much since they'd left the den, but then again, neither had she. "You keep staring at it like it might disappear," he finally said, his voice quieter than usual. Cyril exhaled sharply, gripping the chain a little tighter. "It almost did." Tyler didn't argue. Instead, he stepped forward and sat across from her on another crate, close enough that she could see the flicker of exhaustion in his blue eyes. He was still bleeding from the fight, a thin trail of dried blood running from his temple where Krivox's men had landed a hit. "You should clean that," she murmured. He huffed a small laugh. "You should see the other guy." Cyril rolled her eyes, but reached for a small med kit sitting nearby. "Stay still," she muttered, pulling out a cloth. Tyler raised an eyebrow. "You don't have to. Shut up and let me help." For once, he didn't argue. Cyril dipped the cloth into the antiseptic solution and leaned in. Up close, he smelled like metal and smoke, with a faint hint of something sharper beneath it, like the open air of a world she had never been to. She pressed the cloth against the wound, and he flinched. "Don't be a baby," she muttered. "I'm letting an alien patch me up. I think I deserve some credit." She rolled her eyes again, but this time there was the barest hint of a smile at the corner of her lips. Tyler caught it. Of course he did. "You're different now," he said after a beat. Cyril frowned. "What?" "You're different from when I found you in that alley." His voice was calm, steady, but there was something in it, something that made her chest tighten. "You were ready to fight back there, ready to take your life into your own hands." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus on his wound. "I wasn't going to let them take something from me again." Tyler nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. Silence stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. Cyril felt her pulse quicken, an unfamiliar warmth settling in her stomach. She was too close to him now, her knees nearly brushing against his, her fingers still resting against his skin. His breath was slow, controlled, but there was tension in his shoulders, in the way his eyes flickered down to her lips before snapping back up. Cyril swallowed. "Tyler." The ship rocked suddenly, a distant clang echoing through the hull. Cyril jumped back instinctively, her hand going to the knife at her hip, but Tyler didn't move. "Relax," he murmured. "It's just the engine cooling down." Her heart was still racing, but not from the noise. She forced herself to exhale. "I hate this ship." Tyler smirked. "You hate everything." "That's not true." His smirk softened into something else, something warmer, something she wasn't sure how to handle. "No." Cyril licked her lips, suddenly aware of how close they still were, how the space between them felt too small, too charged. "I don't hate you," she admitted. The words felt dangerous, like stepping too close to the edge of something she couldn't name. Tyler's smirk disappeared entirely. She thought he might make a joke, deflect, turn it into something easy. He didn't. Instead, he reached out, slowly, carefully, as if giving her the chance to pull away. She didn't. His fingers brushed against her cheek, tucking a loose strand of silver-white hair behind her ear. The touch was warm, steady in a way that made her throat tighten. "I don't hate you either," he said, voice barely above a whisper. Cyril felt something snap inside her. She surged forward before she could stop herself, closing the space between them, pressing her lips to his. Tyler tensed for a fraction of a second, just a heartbeat, before he kissed her back. The world tilted. His hand slid to the back of her neck, fingers tangling in her hair, the others settling against her waist, pulling her in as if he'd been waiting for this just as much as she had. Cyril's hands gripped his jacket, holding on to him like he was the only solid thing in a universe that had never stopped shifting beneath her feet. The kiss was desperate, raw, too much and not enough all at once. Tyler exhaled sharply against her lips, and she felt the way his grip tightened, how his body tensed like he was fighting something inside himself. Then, just as suddenly as it started, he pulled back. His breathing was uneven, his forehead resting against hers. "Cyril," he murmured, her name a quiet, rough thing between them. She shivered. "Yeah." His hands were still on her, but his eyes were troubled now, stormy blue instead of fire. He stopped, inhaling deeply before shaking his head. "This isn't simple." Cyril's stomach twisted. "I know, because nothing in her life had ever been simple, and neither had his. But still, she didn't regret it. She pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, searching for something, anything in his expression that told her she hadn't just ruined everything. Tyler sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, clearly frustrated with himself. "I'm not good at this." Cyril let out a breathless laugh. "Neither am I." Something flickered across his face, something like relief. They sat there for a moment, breathing the same air, feeling the weight of what had just happened settle between them. Then, finally, Tyler spoke. "We should get some rest." Cyril's lips parted, but no words came. He was giving her an out, giving both of them an out. Maybe she should take it. Instead, she nodded. "Yeah, rest sounds good." But as she curled up in the small cot on the other side of the ship, her fingers traced her lips, and she knew nothing would ever be the same again. "I'm sending a signal." Tyler peered at the screen. "Who's picking it up?" "Standard emergency frequency. If we're lucky, some trade ship will be passing through." Tyler grunted. "And if we're not lucky?" Cyril didn't answer. They both knew the answer. If the wrong people found them first, they were dead. The distress signal had been sent, but something felt off. Cyril had learned long ago to trust that feeling. The itch in the back of her mind, the warning whisper of danger just beyond sight. Tyler must have felt it too, because his shoulders were tense, his usual casual demeanor taut, with something sharp beneath the surface. Then the console beeped. "Incoming transmission." Cyril's stomach twisted as she pressed the button. Static crackled, followed by a low, gravelly chuckle. "Did you really think you could walk away?" Cyril felt ice flood her veins. Tyler's jaw clenched. "Bracken." Bracken's voice was smug. Too smug. "Oh, don't sound so surprised." One last stand. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were winning. Cyril gritted her teeth, rerouting the last of the power from her wrist device into the signal booster. The small, jury-rigged device sparked violently before stabilizing. The beacon flared to life, broadcasting a powerful distress call across the system. "It's up," she yelled. Tyler didn't hesitate. "Time to move." They sprinted toward higher ground, blaster fire raining down around them. Cyril's legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she pushed forward. One shot. That's all they had. The comm crackled. "Unknown distress call. This is Hauler Ironwind. We are receiving your signal." Cyril's heart leapt. "This is Cyril," she shouted into her communicator. "We are under attack. Need extraction now." A moment of silence. Then, Copy that, Cyril. We're inbound. Hold your position. Cyril turned to Tyler, breathless. They're coming. Tyler grinned, eyes flashing. Then let's make sure we're still breathing when they get here. They turned back to the fight. You made this personal when you humiliated me back on Vaxori. Cyril's grip tightened on the console. How did you find us? Bracken let out a slow, amused sigh. Oh, I have my ways. You left a nice little trail for me to follow. That ship of yours? Not as untraceable as you thought. Cyril cursed under her breath. They had been tracked. Tyler didn't hesitate. He pushed himself up and grabbed his jacket, already moving toward the ship's exit. We can't stay here. Cyril followed, her mind racing. We need a plan. Tyler gave a sharp nod. Then we better come up with one fast, because they'll be here soon. The cold wind howled against the rocky terrain as they moved away from the wreckage. Every step was painful, their injuries slowing them down, but they didn't have a choice. They reached a small overhang, a natural rock formation that provided a decent view of the crash site without exposing them completely. Tyler scanned the horizon, his expression grim. The silence after the crash was deafening. Cyril coughed, the thick scent of smoke and scorched metal clogging her lungs as she pushed herself upright. Her entire body ached, bruises forming beneath her skin for where the impact had slammed her into the ship's interior. The dim emergency lights flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the wreckage. She turned her head, her pulse spiking. Tyler! A groan. Then movement. Cyril scrambled forward, ignoring the sharp sting in her ribs as she reached him. He was slumped against the console, blood trailing down from a fresh gash at his temple. His eyes fluttered open as she grabbed his shoulder, his breathing uneven. Hey, she said, shaking him lightly. You with me? Tyler blinked, then winced. Define with you. His voice was hoarse, but alive. Relief crashed over her like a tidal wave. Damn it, Tyler, she muttered, half scolding, half breathless. He gave a weak smirk, but didn't argue. We down? Cyril huffed, sitting back on her heels. Yeah, hard. The ship was wrecked. There was no getting it back in the air, at least not anytime soon. Sparks still crackled from the fried circuits, the faint smell of burning wires seeping into the cold air. They needed to move. Cyril glanced toward the viewing panel, hoping to see something, anything, that could help them. But all she saw was a vast, barren wasteland stretching out before them. Rocky cliffs in the distance, an ashen sky above, and absolutely nothing else. Where the hell are we? Tyler grumbled, pushing himself up with a wince. Cyril scanned the surroundings, her brows furrowing. Uncharted moon, most likely. No settlements, no ships in the vicinity. We're stranded. Tyler exhaled sharply, rubbing the blood from his temple. Perfect. She ignored his sarcasm, pressing a few buttons on the barely functioning console. One emergency function was still operational, the distress beacon. All right, she muttered. 3 ships inbound, he muttered. Bracken doesn't do things halfway. Cyril's pulse pounded in her ears. They were outnumbered, outgunned, stranded, but they weren't dead yet. She turned to Tyler. You still have that signal booster in your pack. Tyler's brows furrowed. Yeah, but it's useless without power. He stopped, then glanced at her. Unless... Cyril smirked. Unless we overcharge it. Tyler let out a low whistle. That could work. If we can amplify the distress beacon enough, it might break through interference and reach someone who can actually help us. Cyril nodded. But we need time. Tyler's smirk was sharp. Then let's give ourselves some. The first shot rang out just as Cyril finished setting up the booster. The ground exploded beside her, sending up a spray of dust and debris. She flinched but didn't stop working. Tyler returned fire from behind cover, his stolen blaster sending red-hot plasma bolts toward their attackers. Any day now, princess. The cold air stung Cyril's lungs as she pressed her back against the jagged rock, her pulse hammering in her ears. Blaster fire screeched through the thin atmosphere, scorching the ground just inches from her boots. They were pinned down. She risked a glance over the edge of the rocky outcrop. Bracken's crew was closing in. 3 sleek, Black armored figures moved through the smoke, weapons drawn, scanning for movement. The wreckage of her and Tyler's ship still smoldered in the distance, casting an eerie orange glow over the barren landscape. A plasma bolt exploded against the rock near her head, sending debris flying. Cyril gritted her teeth, ducking lower. "This is bad," she muttered. Tyler was crouched beside her, gripping the blaster he had taken from Bracken's men earlier. His jaw was clenched, sweat beading along his temple where blood still crusted from his earlier injury. "I don't disagree." Cyril exhaled sharply. "Any bright ideas?" Tyler glanced at the comm device strapped to her wrist, the one still transmitting a distress signal to the incoming hauler. "How long until they get here?" 5 minutes. Maybe less. He nodded. "Then we just have to survive until then." Cyril gave him a deadpan look. "Oh, is that all?" Tyler smirked. "You're catching on." The first wave hit fast. Bracken's men were well-trained, ruthless, and out for blood. Plasma fire lit up the darkness, sending streaks of deadly light between the jagged rock formations. Cyril and Tyler moved fast, shifting cover to cover, returning fire when they could. But they were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time. Cyril's breath came in sharp, measured bursts as she ducked behind an old supply crate, her blaster's power cell running low. "I'm almost out." "Join the club," Tyler called back, firing off another shot before dropping behind cover. Cyril gritted her teeth. "Think, Cyril. Think." She scanned the terrain. They needed an advantage. Something, anything that could turn the tide. Then she saw it. A fuel cell, partially buried in the sand, half cracked but still intact. A plan formed in her mind, sharp and reckless. She turned to Tyler. "Cover me." He frowned. "What are you?" But she was already moving. Blaster fire chased her across the open ground as she sprinted toward the broken fuel cell. She slid behind it, breath coming in sharp gasps. One shot. That's all she needed. She raised her blaster, aimed, and fired. The explosion was immediate. A shockwave of fire and debris erupted outward, engulfing 2 of Bracken's men before they had time to react. Cyril barely had time to throw herself to the ground before the blast sent a tremor through the rocky terrain. A deep, thunderous crack split the air. The cliffside above them began to crumble. Tyler's eyes widened. "Run!" Cyril didn't need to be told twice. She scrambled to her feet, dodging falling rocks as she sprinted back toward Tyler. Behind her, Bracken's last remaining enforcer was caught in the collapse, his scream lost beneath the roar of tumbling stone. Cyril dove behind cover just as dust and debris surged past them. Silence. Only the distant crackle of fire and the howling wind remained. She coughed, blinking through the haze, turning toward Tyler. He was staring at her, breathing hard. That, he panted, was insane. Cyril smirked. But effective. Tyler huffed a breathless laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, I'll give you that." A sound cut through the quiet, the distant roar of engines. Cyril snapped her head up. The sky above shimmered with streaks of light as a massive hauler descended through the atmosphere. Their ride had arrived. Tyler tapped his comm. "Iron Wind, we see you. Get that ramp down fast. We're coming in hot." The reply came instantly. "Copy that. Be quick about it." Cyril felt relief crash over her. They had done it. They had survived. But Bracken wasn't finished. A guttural growl echoed from the dust. Cyril turned just in time to see him stagger to his feet. His armor was scorched, his face bloodied, but the rage in his eyes burned hotter than the fire, still smoldering in the distance. "You think this is over?" he snarled. Cyril raised her blaster, but Bracken was faster. He lunged, tackling her to the ground. Pain exploded through her back as they hit the rocky surface, Bracken's weight crushing down on her. His hands wrapped around her throat, squeezing. "You ruined everything," he hissed. Cyril gasped, struggling, her vision blurring. Then, a gunshot. Bracken jerked violently, his grip loosening. His eyes widened in shock. Behind him, Tyler stood with his blaster raised, smoke curling from the barrel. Bracken staggered, collapsing to the side, unmoving. Cyril coughed, rolling on her hands and knees, sucking in a ragged breath. Tyler was already kneeling beside her. "You okay?" She nodded weakly. "Yeah, thanks to you." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You really need to stop getting strangled." Cyril let out a breathless laugh. "I'll work on that." The hauler's ramp lowered with a heavy thud. The ship hovered just above the ground, its engines kicking up dust as the pilot waved them forward. "Come on," the captain yelled. "We don't have all day." Tyler helped Cyril up, keeping a firm grip on her as they ran toward the ship. They crossed the threshold just as the ramp began to lift. The door sealed shut behind them. For the first time in what felt like forever, Cyril let herself collapse onto the cold metal floor, gasping for breath. Tyler sat beside her, grinning like a lunatic. "That was a hell of a day," Cyril huffed. Understatement of the century. The ship rumbled as it broke through the atmosphere, leaving the dead moon behind. Cyril turned her head, looking at Tyler. "So what now?" He glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. "I guess we find out." The steady hum of the Iron Wind's engines filled the cargo bay as the ship broke free from the planet's atmosphere. Cyril let her head rest against the cold metal wall, her breath still uneven from the fight. They had done it. They had survived. Across from her, Tyler sat with his back against a supply crate, arms resting loosely on his knees. His face was streaked with dirt and dried blood, his jacket torn from the struggle. And yet, he was smiling. Cyril huffed. "What are you grinning at?" Tyler let out a breathy chuckle, shaking his head. "Just thinking." "About what?" His blue eyes met hers, sharp yet unreadable. "How the hell we're still alive." Cyril smirked, shifting against the floor. "Luck, mostly." Tyler's smirk widened. "Nah, you don't survive something like that on luck alone." A beat of silence passed between them. Then, from the cockpit, the ship's comms system crackled to life. "This is Iron Wind to passengers. We're clear of the system. You want to tell me where we're headed?" Cyril sat up a little, rubbing her temples. Where were they headed? For the first time in her life, she wasn't running toward something just to survive. She had a choice. She looked at Tyler. He was watching her carefully. "Got anywhere you want to go?" he asked, voice quieter now. Cyril exhaled. "No, not really." Tyler leaned his head back against the crate. "Same." A long silence stretched between them. Cyril had spent years drifting, fighting, scraping by. She had never thought about what came after. Maybe, just maybe, this was after. She studied Tyler, her fingers brushing against the cool metal of her necklace. He had fought for her. He had bled beside her. He had risked everything for someone he barely knew. And she had done the same for him. She took a breath. "Somewhere new," she said finally. "Somewhere we don't have to fight just to exist." Tyler glanced at her, something shifting in his expression. "That's a dangerous thing to say to me." Cyril arched a brow. "Why?" His smirk returned, slow and easy. "Because I might just take you up on it." She stared at him for a moment. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against his. Tyler didn't pull away. The ship rumbled beneath them as it slipped into hyperspace, the viewport filling with streaks of starlight. For the first time in her life, Cyril wasn't alone. And for the first time, the future was hers to choose. The Iron Wind drifted silently through hyperspace, its engines humming with steady power. Beyond the viewport, stars stretched into endless ribbons of light, a vast and unknowable future unfolding before them. For the first time in her life, Cyril wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was free. She sat on the edge of a supply crate in the cargo hold, staring at the swirling cosmos beyond the reinforced glass. The future had never looked so open, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that it was too open, that at any moment something would come crashing down and remind her that freedom wasn't meant for people like her. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Tyler leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed, watching her. "You're thinking too hard again." Cyril smirked, glancing at him. "And you don't think enough." Tyler gave a lazy shrug. "That's why we work so well together." Silence settled between them, comfortable this time. Cyril exhaled, fingers absent-mindedly tracing the pendant at her throat. She had fought for this. for something that mattered. For the first time, she let herself ask, now what? Tyler seemed to read the question in her expression. The captain wants to know where we're headed. Cyril hesitated. She had never had that choice before. There had always been a next fight, a next escape, a next desperate move. Now, she could go anywhere. Tyler waited, patient in a way she wasn't used to. He had never pushed her for answers, never demanded more than she was ready to give. That alone made her want to stay. Somewhere new, she said finally. Somewhere I don't have to look over my shoulder every second. Tyler studied her, then nodded. I can work with that. Cyril arched a brow. Just like that. Tyler smirked. You saved my ass. Least I can do is help you figure out what to do with it. She let out a breathless laugh. That's the worst way you could have phrased that. Tyler chuckled, pushing off the wall. Come on, let's tell the captain. He turned toward the cockpit, but before he could take another step, Cyril reached out. Her fingers curled around his wrist, just for a second, just long enough. Tyler stilled. Cyril swallowed hard, feeling her pulse hammering against her ribs. She didn't know how to say it, how to put into words the weight of what they had just survived, what they had fought for. So she didn't. She just squeezed his wrist and hoped he understood. Tyler didn't say anything, but after a beat, he turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. Cyril exhaled, a knot in her chest loosening. She wasn't alone anymore. She never would be again. The iron wind rumbled as it dropped out of hyperspace, the distant glow of a trade hub coming into view, a sprawling mechanical city orbiting a gas giant. A fresh start. Cyril squeezed Tyler's hand one last time before letting go. The future was waiting. The trade hub orbited lazily above a swirling blue-green gas giant, its artificial lights casting a soft golden glow against the endless stretch of space. The iron wind had long since departed, and now, for the first time in what felt like forever, Cyril and Tyler weren't running. They had found a place to breathe, and it was beautiful. Cyril sat on the edge of the docking bay's rooftop, her legs dangling over the ledge as she watched the busy streams of ships weaving in and out of the station. Below them, traders bartered in the marketplace. Mechanics worked on battered freighters, and somewhere in the distance, music drifted up from a cantina, its melody soft and sweet. The air smelled of engine grease and something vaguely floral, probably from one of the alien spice vendors. It was the scent of life, of a place where people weren't just fighting to exist, of a place where maybe they could actually stay. Tyler stepped up beside her, setting down 2 cups of something steaming and vaguely blue. Figured you might be hungry, he said, handing her one. Cyril accepted it, raising a brow. What is it? Tyler took a sip and winced. Hell if I know. Some local drink. Strong as jet fuel, though, so you'll probably like it. Cyril smirked and took a careful sip. It burned, but in a way that spread warmth through her chest instead of setting her throat on fire. Not bad, she admitted. Tyler grinned, leaning back against the rooftop railing. Told you. They sat in companionable silence, watching the station's bustling night unfold below them. Cyril stole a glance at him, at the way the neon lights reflected in his eyes, the way the tension he always carried had finally started to ease. She still wasn't sure what they were, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid to find out. Tyler stretched, then shot her a sidelong look. You're staring. Cyril rolled her eyes. You're my line of sight. It's not my fault your face is in the way. Tyler let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. You know, for someone who just survived a near-death experience, you could be a little nicer. Cyril smirked. You'd think that, wouldn't you? Tyler sighed dramatically, setting his cup aside. You're impossible. And yet, here you are. Tyler turned fully toward her then, closer than she expected. His usual smirk was still there, but something in his gaze had softened, something that made the air between them feel heavier, more charged. Cyril's fingers curled around her cup as her pulse hitched. They had danced around this for days, maybe even since the moment he had pulled her from that alley. And yet, neither of them had said the words. Neither of them had taken that last step. But Tyler was looking at her, like he was about to. You know, he murmured, voice lower now, if you keep looking at me like that, I'm going to start thinking you actually like me. Cyril swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. That would be terrible, wouldn't it? Tyler tilted his head slightly, his smirk turning into something softer. Disastrous. For once, Cyril didn't have a witty reply, because suddenly he was kissing her. And stars help her, she kissed him back. His lips were warm, tasting faintly of whatever strong drink they'd just shared, and his hands found her waist, steady and sure, like she was something worth holding on to. Cyril's fingers curled into his jacket, pulling him closer as the neon lights flickered around them. The station, the noise, the entire galaxy, it all faded. There was only this. Him. Them. When they finally broke apart, just barely, Tyler rested his forehead against hers, his breath still uneven. Cyril let out a slow exhale, her lips curling into a small, almost disbelieving smile. Tyler chuckled softly. Well, that took long enough. Cyril huffed. You could have done that sooner, you know. Tyler smirked. Yeah, but I like making you wait. Cyril punched his arm. He laughed. A real, genuine laugh that sent warmth curling through her chest. She sighed, shaking her head. I should push you off this ledge. Tyler grinned, tightening his grip around her waist. You could try. Cyril rolled her eyes, but didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, letting herself believe, for the first time in a long time, that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found something worth staying for. Something worth fighting for. And this time, she wasn't fighting alone.